Welcome to this month's edition of the Journal Live. I'm Chris Green, executive editor of the Journal. Today is the third in a three-part series focusing on entrepreneurship in the heartland. And today we're going to go somewhere that we don't go all that often at the Kansas Leadership Center. We're taking a field trip in a way to Ord, Nebraska to find out going to another state to figuring out how nurturing entrepreneurship has been a key factor in stabilizing their community's population, creating an economic base, and making it an attractive place for younger folks to live. Over the past 20 years, the area in and around Ord, Nebraska has counted over 125 million of public and private investment, resulting in the creation of more than 100 businesses and 350 jobs. But it hasn't always been this way. Nurturing entrepreneurship has been key for making Ord an attractive place for people to live. And we're here today to discuss what lessons others can learn from the community's successes and challenges that it has faced along the way. And we want to also take an opportunity to try and compare how Ord's experiences compare and connect with those of other heartland communities. So this is a conversation about Ord, Nebraska, but I think this is also a conversation about all of rural America and all of the heartland and all about revitalizing these communities and helping them prepare for a stable and prosperous future. Joining me on today's field trip to Ord is Don Mackey, Senior Vice President of E2 Entrepreneurial Ecosystems, hosted by Network Kansas, as well as several residents from Ord, Nebraska and Valley County itself. Caleb Pollard, co-owner of Scratchtown Brewing Company, is here with me, as well as Trent and Heidi Proskasil, and Trent is the co-owner of Valley Thunder Rods and Restoration. Mike Sherry, the Journal contributor who brought this story in our nationally recognized magazine that focuses on civic leadership issues, is with us, as well as two of my colleagues from the Kansas Leadership Center, Alejandro Arias Esparza and Julia Favis McBride, who have gone on a tour of Nebraska to learn more about entrepreneurship and the issues that communities are facing there. And I guess they will sort of serve as a little bit of our control group. We're wanting to know what are other people in Nebraska talking about, which might help us understand a little more about what we can learn from Ord. But before we dive too deep in the conversation, I want to give each of those individuals a chance to briefly introduce themselves and maybe just highlight what do you hope you see come out of the conversation today? And I'd like to start that dialogue with Don.
Well, thanks, Chris. Great to be with you today. I have worked in the field of community economic development for a long time, and I had the good fortune to start working with Ord back in the late 1990s. And in the last few years, with help from some of the folks on our session today and others, we have curated a massive case study of Ord, and I'll be talking a little bit about that as we get into some of the questions.
Yeah, and I imagine some of those stories and some of the information will connect with two of our business owners, from Ord, Trent, Heidi, and Caleb. Maybe you three could share what would you like to talk about today, or what do you hope comes out of this conversation? You agreed to participate in a conversation with the Kansas Leadership Center, so I'm really excited for our cross-border collaboration.
Heidi or Trent are welcome to jump in, but my name is Caleb Pollard, and I own and operate Scratchtown Brewing Company in Ord, Nebraska, in our downtown business district. And I have about a 20-year history of community economic development and entrepreneurship between two different roles in which I've served over the course of the last 20 years. And I am rural by choice. I love living in rural Nebraska. And one of the things I think for me that grants me tremendous value is making personal connections that help us move our community forward into the 21st century, my business forward into the 21st century. Because I think, and Heidi and Trent can speak to this too, one of the great things about Ord is the interconnected nature of our entrepreneurial community. A lot of us have worked either directly together on collaborative business opportunities or have worked more alongside each other in a collaborative nature that's helped each business out and actually have quite a number of things I can talk about with Valley Thunder Rods and Restoration as to how they've helped my business personally. So that's one of the things I think that you find so unique and so opportune in rural Nebraska is that people are willing to roll their sleeves up and go to work for you.
I think we lucked out at the time we moved to Ord. I think we moved back to Ord in '99, and at that time, all the economic development, business development was just getting started and becoming very intentional. So the foundation was starting to be built when the time was right for Trent and his brother to start the shop, to really, so the community was very able to very well support and guide us in the right direction to move a new business forward. We were the first recipients of the Ord City sales tax loan, and that was just,
It was very helpful.
Yeah.
There's also other, classes and things that were put on that put us on the right path to be successful.
and it's kind of crazy to stop and think about how long this has been going on. Our oldest son is currently an employee at the shop here. So he's gone through school, gone to college, worked out of town for a few years, and now he and his wife live back here. And so, we're starting to see the possibility of transition to another generation. So that's really exciting.
Well, thank you both for being here, and it's exciting to have you because it's like sort of like I think like a way of like testing success. The fact that the Valley Thunder Rods and Restoration has been around so long, and you're like have been able to sustain that, which I think is always a question about entrepreneurship: is how sustainable is it when you start a new business, and to be the first one and still be going, and the fact that you added some really beautiful pictures to our story was wonderful to have you be a part of that. I also want to take a moment to transition to Alejandro and Julia. So you both have Kansas well, but now Nebraska too. What are you hoping to see come up in this conversation?
Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, we had a wonderful trip to Nebraska. We went to Sydney, Ogallala, McCook, Norfolk, O'Neill, and Grand Island all in 1 week, and got to listen to people talk about their dreams and also talk about an upcoming trip to Ord that everybody was excited about, I think, through your organization, Don. And I'm Chief Leadership Development Officer at Kansas Leadership Center. So I think what I really hope to get out of this conversation are what are the leadership lessons? And I'm already hearing Caleb talk about collaboration, and I'm hearing a subtext about inspiring a collective purpose. And just as I read the article and as I listened to you talking about, holding on and growing a business over the course of your oldest son's lifetime, there's a lot about holding to purpose there. And I hope that we'll pull out some lessons and some experiments for Kansans. Alejandro, how about you?
Yeah, I do have to say, Julia, I had no idea Nebraska was that big, but it was a great road trip and we met some great people. And really for me, I am the civic engagement manager here at the KLC. And really what I want to hear, something that I didn't hear much when we were out in Nebraska, which is what role did elected officials play in the progress made in Ord? That's really what I'm really interested in, because that sort of sets the tone into what a community does and how a community works. So I'm really interested in hearing about that.
Well, thank you both. And looking forward to seeing, if those are things, hopefully we'll tackle both those topics. I want to turn now to Mike Sherry, the journal writer who brought us this piece. I have some questions for you, Mike, to sort of get us kicked off. But before I go there, anything you want to talk off the top of your head in terms of like what you'd like to see come up?
No, I mean, I'm just kind of the guy who wrote the story. So you guys are in the trenches. I mean, I'd just like to hope that my story, provides a launching pad for the discussion essentially. And, hopefully it just, provided enough, thought-provoking content that we can build off of it and, have a good conversation.
Well, thank you, Mike. We kind of gave you a tough challenge. Like we wanted you to capture what's going on in Ord, Nebraska, and we also wanted to have you make that relevant to Kansas. So you also spent time in Alma and Council Grove, and you talked to many sources in Ord. What patterns did you see? Emerging in the heartland in general when it comes to fostering entrepreneurship and the challenges of that, as well as what's working.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the patterns that I experienced both in Ord and Council Grove and Alma, I think a lot of them came out fairly crystal clear. I mean, I think the biggest one, and Caleb certainly can speak to this, is ignoring the naysayers. Put your nose to the grindstone. There's always going to be people who are second guessing what you're doing. I mean, Caleb had it. A couple of the folks in Council Grove had it. So you just put your blinders on and get to work, which is, I guess, not, I mean, you would expect that of entrepreneurs, but that was really probably one of the biggest patterns I saw. And I mean, the other side of that coin is just grit and determination. I mean, Chris, you brought up the fact that you like Morgan's quote once. I mean, from Alma, we're just grinding. They just grind away. You ignore the naysayers, you grind away. So that's the other side of that coin. The other thing that I found as a pattern, and that you all have hit upon in other conversations, is overcoming, some blight in downtown. Most of these districts are trying to revitalize the downtown, and one of the patterns that has emerged really is overcoming absentee landlords or something, who can, whether you want to buy the building or just help beautify the downtown. That was a universal theme that people really needed to help. And, to Alejandro's point, I mean, I think in Council Grove or in Alma, one of them, they really got the elected officials to kind of kick these absentee landlords in the pants a little bit and say, look, do something or get out. So that was another kind of universal theme. The other thing that I thought too, which emerged also both with what Caleb and some of the folks in Council Grove were saying, was creating this environment, this inviting environment that feeds upon itself. When Deidre and Jesse are doing this in Council Grove, or Caleb is doing it in Ord, is that you are creating an environment for a younger set of people to feed upon itself, and to be self-sustaining. And so those were, and the other thing that I hadn't thought about until Caleb brought it up was, but certainly the interconnectedness and the esprit de corps that I found both in certainly in Alma and in Council Grove. I mean, they're different businesses, so they're not really competitors, but there is certainly a high degree of collaboration. And if the antique store down the road is doing well, then we want the beef store up the road to do. So those were the main patterns that emerged.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you for reporting. Your story has been a real hit on our website and on social media, generating a lot of interest. One thing that I have become curious about, as I've heard the stories from Council Grove and Alma and from Ord, is like, what is it that makes a place different? Like, you can't really see entrepreneurship directly happening, and a culture and an ecosystem of entrepreneurship directly happening, but you can look at a town and you can kind of tell that something's happening there that's different. And so I was hoping, Heidi, Trent, Caleb, can you take us inside the entrepreneurial culture of Ord and what it's like, and what do you think's special about it?
Well, I think one of the things that I've always been really happy about in our community is we don't ask permission to roll our sleeves up and get things done. We identify both opportunities and challenges within the community, and we build coalitions to go out and address them. And I know that Alejandro had asked the question about what role did elected officials play in ORD's growth. And I think that's an opportune time for me to discuss that, because I have tremendous experience in working with elected officials at both the local, the state, and the federal level to address our issues within our community, both in my prior role as economic development director, but also in the last 10 years as president of Scratch Down Brewing Company. Is they serve a facilitative role in that many times they may not necessarily be in the trenches tackling some of these community objectives, but they have been engaged and included and communicated with regularly through the years, so that they are both held accountable as well as depended upon as assets to challenge both the status quo and jump into a number of different objectives to get things done within our community. And I speak specifically on whether that is our sales tax program for economic development, which is a funding resource for entrepreneurial growth, but it's also a funding resource for infrastructure deployment to facilitate economic development. In addition, they've also been really, really important in tackling the soft side of economic development, which is community development objectives that make Ord and Valley County a better place to live for our target audience. If I was in fact talking to someone last night in our tap room about this very specific issue, is Heidi and Trent and myself and my wife and a lot of our peers may not necessarily be in what we would call formal leadership roles within the community, but what we're doing by nature of working in our businesses or volunteering for a wide variety of different community needs is we're in what we call the sausage making of community that actually makes Ord really super cool and exciting and a place to be a part of. So bringing it back to my original point, I don't want to say we have a hands-off leadership approach at all, but what we do have is a much more collaborative atmosphere where people say, hey, you know what, I really want to be involved in deploying more trails to support outdoor recreation within our community. But you know what, we've tried and unfortunately failed a half dozen times on a bike trail north of town to Elyria, Nebraska, which is about 5 miles. Let's look at our river instead, and let's make the river a trail. And so what we've been able to do is build a very ad hoc coalition of partners that have come together, and now we're looking at phase 2 and 3 of a river trail project that connects nodes of access to our river for kayakers, canoers, and tubers, or what we like to do in Nebraska is float and horse tanks down the river. And it provides another element of recreation for people our age or younger or older that we didn't have before. And it oftentimes, happens around a cold pint of beer in our tap room where we say, hey, what do we want to do next? And there's never in my opinion, a roadblock to people rolling up their sleeves and saying, you know what, I take permission myself to tackle these challenges and make our community a better place to live.
So it sounds like you don't just have a culture of entrepreneurship, you have a culture of leadership in which elected officials play a role, but there are a lot of other people who play roles, which is really consistent with how KLC sees leadership, that leadership is an activity, not a position that anyone can do. I am curious though, are elected officials in community, what percentage of the time are they on the same page exactly? Is it always smooth sailing all the time, or
no?
Where is there conflict, and what issues does that surface around?
Well, Ord is a human community populated with humans, so we have conflict here, and it's ebb and flow, but I would say 75 to 90% of the time our elected officials are very supportive of entrepreneurial activity and economic development. And oftentimes I've found that when you don't find support from your elected officials, it's not because they're against the premise. That's one of the things that I have done over the years in consulting roles I've done as a side gig, is sit everybody down and say, okay, what is your hope and dream for the future of your community? And once you post everyone's responses anonymously, what you find is that most everyone in a community, especially rural communities, want the same things for the rural community. They just have personal conflicts or history or other things that being diligent and being empathetic and also being authentic, you can really work through those challenges to motivate people to work together to achieve common objectives. And that's one of the things I think in org where we've seen conflict, it comes from a place of trust or communication more so than it does from any real disagreement about what our actual objectives are. Now, there are some people, I know everyone on this conversation knows what cave people are. We call them troglodytes. And those people are going to be the sticks in the mud that don't want any sort of change or new objective to happen. And as I, in the article, I spoke about some of that, but as long as you listen to them, in my opinion, and you acknowledge their opinion, you don't have to listen to it. And you don't have to give them any more time than that, in my opinion, to reach for that positive change that we've tried to make happen in Ord and Valley County.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So there's both a sense of like acknowledging their views and their voices, but also not letting it stand in the way, like when you have a critical mass of people who want progress to happen. Well, thanks for those comments, Trent. Heidi, I'm interested in your experience. Like, what do you make of the entrepreneurial culture in Ord, and like how has that supported you, and what challenges have you experienced?
I think there was and John can probably speak to this as well, back in those late 90s, there was a very intentional shift of what do we want our community to look like in 20 years. And I think those people put their heads down, got to work, and they made it happen. And not only did they create that culture, but they've inspired enough of us here to join in their efforts to make that sustainable for the long term. And it's just not that uncommon in Ord for people to say, what do we want to see and how do we do it? We don't, we're not content to just sit back and, well, small community, middle of Nebraska, what can we do? We say, what can we do? And let's do it. So.
Anything you'd like to add, Trent?
No, not at this moment. Sorry.
That's all right. Well, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Would like to switch to Dawn. And you've done a lot of work, like logging what's happened in Ord and what it means. And I'm curious, what do you see that's special about Ord, and how did it happen from your vantage point?
Well, I think it's great that you've included Thunder Valley and Caleb in this. I mean, Thunder Valley was the first deal, and you're right, Heidi. It was a transition point where the community began to say there are people in this community that have dreams, and maybe if we help them, if we partner with them, we can grow a better community and economy. I'd like to answer your question by going to Bob Stoll's advice. Bob Stoll's a legacy leader in Ord, and recently I asked Bob, what advice would you give to other rural communities? And he immediately came back with three things. The most important thing is empowering leadership, and that's already been talked about. The second is be willing to invest, and that includes using taxing authority to invest in the community. And the third is double down on supporting entrepreneurship. And in so many ways, those three pieces are foundational, I think, to why Ord is where it is today. Specific to the leadership piece, Ord's been very intentional, and they've been willing to invest. In 2001, one of the first things they did as a community is they created Leadership Quest. They said, we want to create ways for people in the community to become more activists, play both formal and informal leadership roles. That grew into Sinovation Valley Leadership Academy, which we think is a world-class leadership program. But they've also embraced this idea of mentoring. Caleb talked about it. People helping people, business to business, leader to leader. And to speak about government, I think it's fair to say in the 1980s, government was not a player. It was a barrier. It was saying no to things. And part of this transformation that Heidi talked about was County government, think about it. They took the county farm and they gifted it, and it became a commercial industrial park. The city was able, with the effort of a lot of citizens, to pass a sales tax and then bond issues, things that were not possible in the previous 20, 30 years. And so we see leadership as the agent. And our friend, David Iaquinta, who's been capturing some of the stories, Caleb spent a lot of time with David. He talks about that one of the things that ORD has created is resident agency. And by agency, it's what, Caleb's talked about. People feeling like they have the right and the ability to say, we need to do something. We need to build a new water park. We need to support a business like Utopia Spa, and to actually organize, take their case to the community, get a fair hearing, get support, and to do something. That's important because part of what ORD's been able to do that other rural communities haven't is stimulate and support multiple projects every year for the past 22 years. And that's really resulted in this transformative change that's illustrated by the investment. Mike in his story talks about 125 million that has gone into the community. There's another 125 million that went into just the healthcare system and the ethanol complex. And you think about a community of 2,000, a region of 10,000, that's $250 million of documented public and private investment. That's amazing. And that speaks to the fact that you've got to have this agency where people are saying, we need to do this, we need to do that, and they're able to go pull that off. And then I think the final point is ORD is unique because of the transformative change. At the end of the day, is the community doing better? And, in the research, it's clear that ORD has achieved transformative change. Probably the most telling statistic is population. Over the last 20 years, rural Nebraska has lost 12% of its population. Valley County has stabilized and has been able to maintain their population, and ORD has actually grown. That's really telling. While rural Nebraska lost 9% of its employees, ORD has gained 9% and has become an employment hub. So we can go through all the stats. I won't do that today because we want to keep the conversation going. But this is an important story because it talks about what's possible when a community creates agency, rooted in leadership, willing to invest, and in turn that leads to these kind of changes that really does make ORD a remarkable community.
Chris, can I just say one quick thing? Because one of the things, just piggybacking on what Don said, and it's very clear, and Chris, you and I talked about it very early on in the story, is that I think the lesson learned from ORD is that it's got to be a multifaceted approach. They didn't jettison traditional economic development. They pulled themselves together and lured an ethanol plant there. They saved the local hospital, which is again a fairly tried and true. So what I took away from ORD and what I think is very valuable to other communities in Kansas is that you basically throw all the spaghetti against the wall. It's not just simply supporting entrepreneurs. You can't just discard what some people may think of as traditional eco-devo, which is a bad word in terms of throwing incentives at people. It's got to be a multifaceted approach.
Yeah, that's such an important point, Mike. And I think the ethanol complex really speaks to that. They lured an ethanol facility, it failed, they got a new owner, it renewed. But then you look at all the allied development that came from local investors and entrepreneurs, the truck stop, the truckers, the cubing plant, the distiller grain, all of that. The community again, and Caleb, you said this really well. There's an opportunity. Let's go capitalize it. A lot of towns have ethanol plants, but they don't have an entire cluster of value-added activities around it. That was local entrepreneurs and local investors. It speaks to the culture that's rooted in this community.
And about that culture, like your organization, Don, looks at entrepreneurial ecosystems. where do we see ecosystems reflected in the org story? And what is that? Is that about those businesses being together? Is it about the way that entrepreneurs support each other? Like, what are the key elements we should look for when we think of signs that a community has a good entrepreneurial ecosystem?
I think it goes back to the basic ground game. I mean, there's a lot of bells and whistles, but early on, remember, with Valley Thunder, Nancy reached out, talked to you guys, talked about the LB 840, and a deal got put together that allowed your dream to go forward. And then Caleb, when you were the economic developer, you were at a very high level of reaching out to entrepreneurs, listening to them and saying, how can we help you? And I don't think we can say enough about that basic effort that you got to take time to talk to people, listen to them, build a relationship, find out what they want to do, and then say, is there a way we can help? And maybe it's some gap financing, maybe it's a mentor, maybe it's an outside resource. But when you saw the maximum amount of entrepreneurial deal flow, it's when ORD had people who were out talking to other folks saying, what's going on and how can we help you? I mean, would you guys agree that that's, and a lot of communities simply don't do that, but ORD has at times done that at a very high level.
Caleb, Trent, would you like to add anything to that?
I would agree with Don. One of the primary roles I served when I was in economic development here in the community was what I call essentially just an ambassador to our business community. And like Don said, instead of going there and telling them what I think they should do with their business, I spent a good deal of time listening. And through that process became inspired, and so inspired that I had an epiphany myself and said, I've spent 10 years of my life working in economic development and talking and supporting different enterprises to support rural development, but it's time to put my own skin in the game because of that effort. So not only did it, when I was economic development director, I think we invested in 25 different businesses over 5 years and capitalized over $3 million, if I recall my numbers correctly, in private development within those small businesses. And when we did, we look back at the volume of loans that we did over the course of the 13 years of the existence of economic development at that time, right before I left for my startup at Scratchtown, we had a 78% business survival rate after 13 years. And if you look at just the pure numbers across the country, most businesses, around 51% of businesses fail after 5 years. So we had it wasn't just like that initial connection point where we said, hey, what are your needs? What are your assets? How do you want to grow your business? How do you want to transition your business? How do you want to roll down your business? And it didn't end with that conversation. It was a continuous touch point. And so, oftentimes we would see a number of businesses come back after successfully starting their business up through our LB 840 program and ask for more resources to expand that business. And that, I think, to me, is a showcase of a long-term commitment to the enterprise community within our area to say, without you, we have no community. I think that's one of the things I want to really hammer on, if I can just share my opinion quickly, is I think one of the things in rural development we get caught up in my 20 years of experience is focusing more on capacity rather than a direct focus on growing the tax base through business development, because the taxes that are paid by businesses are multitudinal, and they have such an impact if you see that business growth and churn within your local community, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that for us, as long as I've been here, which is almost 15 years, that's been a primary focus of our community, is growing that tax base through private sector investment, not necessarily just incentives. That's one thing I want to be very clear about. There's also one of the things that's really amazing about our LB 840 program is not just the tax collection, but also the repayment back into the program of the loans that have been collected over 22 years. I mean, once you start, everybody knows compounding interest. Once you start investing that money in the small business community and they pay that money back along with those collections through sales tax, you're not talking about a fund of $100,000. You're talking about a fund with millions of dollars that can be deployed at a wide variety of different levels of investment within our community.
Well, thank you for that, Caleb. Before I want to shift to Alejandro and Julia in just a minute, but before I do that, I want to check in with our Director of Communications, Sam Smith, and see what's going on social media, and are there any questions that might be useful to respond to before we move to the next section.
There are one or two questions in the Facebook chat. I will bring them out here. Here's a comment rather from Stacy Schmidt. Welcome, Stacy. Spot on, Caleb. Finding access to capital is the easy part. The retention and deployment of additional needed services is where the rubber meets the road. It is our responsibility to help businesses battle the Dunning-Kruger effect and be their lifeline to help them succeed. Imogene Harris says that Rural Eco Development Director to Entrepreneur Pipeline is fascinating to me. I like how you phrased it. It's like an intentional decision to put their own skin in the game. I see it happen so much in our Kansas communities. And there was one other comment that I wanted to bring out. Someone was asking what the intentional shift looked like, and I'm not sure where in the conversation that happened. I apologize, but does anybody remember that? That might be something that we could bring up.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I can speak to that. And of course, these guys live part of this, but the arc of the story is almost 50 years long, and it really came to a head in the 1980s with the ag crisis, the near loss of the hospital. The community, like so many rural communities, was in crisis. And it kind of goes back to Margaret Mead's point: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Almost in every community that we've looked at, Ord included, it was a group of people who came together in the community and said, we've got to do something different. And it was the ag crisis that catalyzed. The community was conflicted. Government wasn't working for change. There was a whole set of issues. And Heidi mentioned this. In 1999 was kind of that pivot point where the community said, we've got to do something. And they started looking at other communities. They began to partner with folks, and they began to build this strategy that's resulted in transformative change. And there's a real rich storyline in some of the interviews. Mike captures this in his story. But this was a do or die moment, because a lot of communities like Ord, if you look at where they're at today, they no longer have 2,000 people. They no longer have a region with 10,000 people. They've got maybe 1,000 people, and their region is atrophied because they did not do the things that this community did.
Well, shifting to Julia and Alejandro, you've traveled a lot throughout Nebraska as part of the Heartland Together tour, and now Ord is sort of like your kind of last virtual stop to learn more about. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about as you hear what Dawn and others have said about what's going on in Ord, and then like what you heard in other places in Nebraska, and what connections do you see, and what sort of learnings do you see emerging from the Ord story?
You want to start us off, Alejandro?
Sure. Well, I have a first couple of initial thoughts, right? And I think Caleb mentioned this earlier, which is this whole idea of everybody wants to see their town succeed, right? But everybody holds their own values, and there's obviously conflict in any human experiment, which is what we live in. And I saw that true in every stop that we made in Nebraska, from our Spanish only sessions to our English sessions, and really everywhere was they all want to see their towns thrive, but the way that they see success is different. But the one theme that came up was like that resiliency of being able to communicate, and a lot of folks that we talk to are not talking to the folks that disagree with them, right? So we talked about those cave people. Well, whenever the 7 people that show up to every meeting would show up to those meetings, they never invited the naysayers. They never invited those folks that maybe had different ideas, because the last thing they wanted to hear was no and no and no. But Caleb made a really good point of like, you have to integrate those ideas. You have to bring those folks in, because they have a role to play in a town's success. And then just another quick point, we said earlier, something about finding capital is the easy part. But that's not what I heard in some of the communities that we went to. And I'm speaking specifically to our Spanish session. So like Spanish business owners do not hear about capital investments, or they don't hear about capital loans in the present. They always hear it in the past. You should have applied for that loan. You should have accessed those resources. So I do kind of want to bring that in because it's a pretty important role in rural communities and those like Spanish speaking demographics that are growing. So I didn't hear that. And it's kind of intriguing. And I do want to speak a little further about capital because I want to hear where those resources come from and the way that they are communicated. Because I am assuming at this point that ORD does a really good job of communicating where resources are found, of who to bring to those meetings and who to integrate into those meetings. So kind of want to hear a little more about that, but those two themes really stood out for me.
Well,
I want to go back. I think, Heidi, you raised the question, what do we want our community to be like in 20 years, and how that's been a guiding quest that set you off on the work. And it seems to have been a guiding light for people in ORD to maybe, if they're talking in the tap room, that you're diagnosing the situation. And it sounds like you're always diagnosing from a stance of strength and aspiration. And yeah, you're talking about what concerns you, but you're also pairing that. We saw that, we heard that in other Nebraska communities. We heard people talking about wanting a place that maintains its small town values and grows and maybe has more diversity and more activities for young people and is able to attract more young families back to that community. So we heard that, and I have a little bit of a sense that over the last 20 or so years, ORD has gotten really good at that. ORD has gotten really good at saying, what are our aspirations? What are our concerns? And how can we kind of head in the same direction across that gap between our concerns and our aspirations? Differently, maybe different people doing different things, but we're headed in the same direction. So I think there's that some of what maybe other communities in the heartland have to learn from you is the continual aspiration and the continual sense of we're experimenting. There's no one leader or set of leaders. We're all possibly exercising leadership to get that river trail. It's now a river trail. We wanted a trail, but it's now a river trail. We're experimenting to just keep the energy in the community.
And I would say, Julia, having been on the tour in Iowa and then hearing what our colleagues have said in Kansas and Nebraska, that these themes are that you mentioned aren't just consistent in Nebraska, they're consistent very much across the region, and they show up in Mike's story. Dawn, it looked like you were wanting to jump in at some point. I'm curious what's on your mind, and what were you hoping to add?
So it goes to the old adage, if you want to catch fish, go to a lake that has fish. And I think central to this is ORD's willingness to work with a much greater diversity of entrepreneurial talent. In the 1990s, if you were a woman and you wanted to start a business, you better have your father, brother, or husband co-sign the loan. That's not true today. If you were a young person, it would be really difficult 20 years ago to get support from the community, just going, they don't have enough experience, they don't have deep financial pockets. So if you look at ORD, we looked at 100 different small business deals. 80% of those were from new residents, young people, and women. Not saying anything against the rest of the group, but that's where the entrepreneurial juice was. And I think part of it's intentional. If you look at what Network Kansas is doing, they looked at communities that are minority majority, largely Hispanic, meatpacking towns, and goes, we're not doing any deals in those communities. Why? So they went out and started having conversations, knowing that most of the entrepreneurial activity was in those communities, saying, why aren't they getting loans? Why aren't they getting help? And beginning to have the conversation, to your point, that, yeah, if you are a first generation immigrant who worked in the meatpacking plant and wants to start a business, getting a loan is tough. Getting financial support is tough. But when communities step back and say, well, gosh, that's where the juice is, maybe we should support the people who want to do this, then you change that environment. And I think that's why ORD, by opening up who they would work with, created a whole bunch of opportunities that otherwise would have never gotten off first base.
Hey, Chris, you mind? So one of the things that I found, and I didn't really get to talk about it too much in the story, but we're focusing a lot on younger families. But I think another thing that's important is that ORD also set its sights on retirees, and that you can't, and that's another part of the recipe. I mean, of that, people who are in their mid 50s or whatever and want to retire, they have disposable income. So some of these entrepreneurs are people who have decided to retire in these communities and have brought their years of experience. So, and I think, I mean, Jim McGregor, who was in Wabunsee County in Kansas, is a perfect example. He found the Flint Hills as an Army officer and wanted to retire in Wabunsee, and is now lending his expertise to developing. So I think it's not just the younger folks. There's also a very you can be very intentional on recruiting midlife or older people who can add to that ecosystem.
Yeah, and it seems like the intentionality might be one of the key lessons to take from there, that there were intentional focuses on those things and plans and strategy and thinking about it, and not just expecting people to show up. Like one of the, I guess, like, there are a couple of tensions when I think about elevating the ORD story. And one of them on my mind right now is I'm sure, like, not everything in ORD is perfect. And I'm curious, like I've never been to a community that doesn't have at least some gap between the reality and their aspirations. So I'm wondering, like, when we think about ORD in Valley County, like what's the next big thing, or what does progress look like into the future? And I was wondering if our friends from ORD or Dawn could speak to that.
I would say that one of when we started the economic development and entrepreneurial process so long ago, we saw our population aging and not a lot of young people moving back. Well, now we are at a point where we've created the problem that we've got so many young people in the community having children, and we are short on daycares and housing. And so that is a problem, because we've got people wanting to work, wanting to start businesses, and they don't have daycare for their kids. So that's something we're definitely going to be, well, we're already working on that, and housing is another big project. So we've created our own best problems here. So
What about you, Caleb? Any thoughts on what you'd like to see taken on next?
One of the, I think, the opportunities we've seen through the last 2 years of the pandemic is not everybody wants to live in an urban environment anymore. And I think the antipathy towards living in an urban environment has really reached a crescendo in my 20 years experience in this realm. And I think that's, for us, like Heidi said, she's absolutely right. We have created some of our own challenges based off of growth. And, that might seem a little smarmy, but it's a reality. And that's the reason why we're investing $1 million into one of our first major expansions in childcare facilities within the community that'll take one facility here from 40 spots in the preschool to up to 105. And we know with fairly strong certainty that will already be completely booked by the time that they open their doors. And we're going to need to pivot and do a second one. In addition to that, going back to what Mike said about retirees, what you often see is with these young families that are moving here, you're seeing their parents in tow. And my business partner and his wife moved here from South Dakota when they're originally from this area, and they brought with them his wife's mom and dad. And so you have different housing needs for different age groups. And one of the things that we found is that not only do we don't have adequate existing housing that is transitory as people, enter into like the home buying market in their mid to late 20s to early 30s, but that the retirees don't have adequate facilities in which to move into that are single floor houses that don't have steps, that also have to have storm shelters because we're in Tornado Alley, so on and so forth. So we have tackled that to some degree, but I further expect us to continue to manage those needs with our existing programs. And ultimately at the end of the day, though, I think for us, the next big thing for us is to really focus on how we can maximize opportunity around this urban flight that we've seen from the pandemic. I think there's a lot of conversation around what's wrong with rural America without asking, like, there's a lot wrong with urban America. And, we seem to think as a country that that everyone is wired to want to live in metropolitan centers, and that's just not true. And now, as we're all talking across the United States to each other right now, a multitude of different platforms and technologies that allow small businesses to be competitive in a global marketplace. And more importantly, is we're selling ourselves short in rural communities by just how competitive we can be in helping people start businesses. I gave a tour to a bunch of ag educators and high school ag educators at the brewery last night. And one of the things I spoke to them about was take the message back home to your kids and say, listen, you can own things in rural America. You can afford to own them, as opposed to the shrinking ownership gap that you're seeing, or excuse me, the expanding ownership gap that you're seeing in urban centers, whether it's homes, businesses, real estate, whatsoever. You can do those things still out here in rural America, and you can do them competitively. So I think for us, it goes back to what Heidi talked about, is we have challenges that we've created through our success, and they're very real. And that's what we've been talking about recently, outside of, the nuts and bolts of continuing to support our existing programs that have had success over 25 years.
I don't know whether to be inspired by the idea that success seems to create more problems, or to be warned or cautious about that. But that seems like it might be tempting for communities to think that, oh, if we just solve this entrepreneurship question, this economy question, we won't have any more problems. And that just doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, Chris, I mean, let's level with everyone on this conversation. There's always going to be challenges in communities that we have to confront. And in the article that Mike wrote, one of the things I talked about was burnout. I think we have to give people space to say that they're going to ebb and flow in their roles within the community, and we need to respect that. Not everybody wants to be a 30-year volunteer for the Economic Development Board. There are a few diehards that love that, but not everyone does, and I think that's okay to allow people that creative freedom to migrate through whatever role they see themselves within those communities, and support them when they do that. That, I think, fundamentally what makes Ford right, regardless of us being a human community, is that most people are valued and they're given that space to fulfill whatever role they choose to fulfill. And at the end of the day, I think it gives people space to re-energize, to come back to community objectives and to flex their muscle to help make things happen.
Yeah. And it feels like that might be when you're talking about that, you're talking about the story of others, but it feels like it might be kind of your story too in the community.
Well, totally. I mean, I've told people, and David Iaquinta is one of them, one of the big reasons why I took a big step back, and Heidi and Trent are just finishing this journey too. We had high school aged kids, and you get one shot to watch your kids grow up, and then they move out and they go on to other endeavors. And while we're, sitting in the stands watching our kids, whether they compete in Science Olympiad or whether they are in basketball or wrestling or whatever, we're still volunteering at the library. We're still volunteering at coaching basketball, for example. I mean, there's other roles in which we serve that may not be formal, that we prioritize above formal leadership roles within the community, just because we want to be closer to our family. And I think that's lost in this conversation about why many of us move to or choose to stay in small towns. is because it is so family focused. I mean, that's one of the things my business partner talks all about often with our family owned brewery. What's the first word in that sentence? We're family. And we have to focus on the fact that we balance our business needs with those of our family. And so if we're cutting out at 2:00 in the afternoon to go watch our kids run track, well, that's just the way it's going to be. You know what I mean? And I think that's one of the things that we don't have to deal with as much when you live in an urban environment because of the spatial distance in which you have to travel in urban environments to necessarily be a part of your family, whether it's commute or you work in one community, you live in another. I mean, there's a lot of things that impede upon that. And so I think for us, you're right. The burnout happens. It happened to me. I had to take a step back, and as my kids age out of the house and head to college, like, well, I'm absolutely going to re-engage. That re-engagement will look entirely different, but it will still be something in which I want to do, because at the end of the day, I want to see my community thrive. I don't want to see my community just get by and survive.
I think Caleb makes a really important point, and it speaks to the fact that if you commit to investing in empowering leaders and you begin to say everyone in our community has the potential to be a community builder, to be a leader in the community, you then have a much larger pool of people. If you're depending on 5 or 7 of the same folks to lead the community year in and year out, you will never have the bandwidth that you need to do the diversity of things that a community like Ord has done. And that's why that investment, that first piece of advice that Bob made, I think is so important, because the more people you engage, the more opportunity they have to lead. That is an asset that trumps all other assets, in my opinion.
Well, one of the things that I think is interesting about elevating Ord, and another conflict that the sort of Mike surfaces in his story, is that, we want to learn from this story, and also there's no one formula that works everywhere in every community exactly the same. So I'm wondering, looking for maybe some closing comments of either from each of our panelists, one thing to take from Ord that every community should learn from, or one thing that every community just has to figure out on their own as they go through this process.
Well, I'll start. I'll be bold. I think if people take and look at a community like Ord, and there's great communities in Kansas as well, you're going to find a lot of the same ingredients, and you're going to find a lot of the same traits. And while you can't cookie cutter it, I do think one of the first things communities need to do is go visit other communities that they perceive are doing better. Take the time to learn from them. That's what Ord did early on. They talked to Cliff Messner in Central City in the 1990s, because Central City was kind of moving ahead. And I just think that's critically important to say there are ingredients in this formula that are pretty universal, and communities like Ord and other successful communities demonstrate that, and it's worth taking a look at how they put that together and sustain it.
I would go back to what Caleb said about conflict from a place of trust. I love that. And I would say the advice for communities, rural, urban, and everything in between, is be purposeful about building processes and containers to have conflict from a place of trust among a wide range of voices.
I think adding a little to Julia's, the word intentionality comes to mind quite a bit. Find your purpose and your identity. Some of the communities we visited, they were trying to find that. They haven't quite found it yet, so that they don't know what they were working towards. But finding your purpose and your identity, and then the pride in your community. If you don't have that pride, then how can you really work towards good? So owning up to your community and being able to work towards something good, and being intentional about that.
Well, thank you, everyone. We have arrived, I think, to the end of our field trip to Ord. And I want to thank our panelists from Nebraska for offering their insights about what's going on in your community and the lessons for entrepreneurship. Thank you to Julia and Alejandro for sharing your insights from the rest of Nebraska. Thank you to Mike for bringing this story to us and prompting this discussion. This concludes our current series of events related to entrepreneurship, but this certainly won't be the last time that we provide coverage of this topic or that we're entering into a discussion. But I hope you've had a chance to participate in these discussions, learn from them. Please keep talking to us. Please keep sending us your questions. Please keep sending us ideas for other orgs or other success stories to cover. Solutions journalism is a huge part of what the Journal advances, and we love going to communities and telling stories that other people can learn from. And this is just a great example of us being able to do that. And so we're grateful for all the cooperation that we received in Kansas as well as in Nebraska to talk to our reporters and let us photograph things. And it was just a lot of fun to think about our universe being a little bit bigger than we usually do. So this concludes our series. Thank you for everyone who participated in our events and have read our stories. And we will be with you next month for another edition of Journal Live. Until then, I wish you well.